At the A4ID Socio-Economic Rights event on Monday the 16th of July 2012, Professor Carolyn Hamilton of the Coram Children's Legal Centre considered the rights of children and the implementation of the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Carolyn Hamilton. I'm at the Coram Children's Legal Centre, and I'm going to talk a bit about juvenile justice and access to justice. I spent a lot of my time working as a consultant for UNICEF, sometimes UNODC, but mainly UNICEF, working with central government to try and actually implement the convention. And as you've heard from my colleague here, many states have signed up, have ratified, but implementing isn't always an easy job. And particularly it isn't easy with respect to access to justice. Now, I get taken to all sorts of really exciting places to work with central government on, usually, law reform. If you look at the way the UK does it, we generally start with a policy, we have a consultation, then comes the bill, it goes through Parliament, and on the back of that comes practice reform, use of the courts. That doesn't always happen when I work abroad. And sometimes I'm wheeled in to see some deputy prime minister, as I was in, say, Kyrgyzstan, and they say, just write a law. And you'll say, well, you know, what sort of law would you like? Well, just do it. Or what about the content of the law? And I mean, they look at you with amazement. Oh my God, she wants to know what the content will be. Can I change things? And quite often they say, yes, do whatever you want. Just do it. So I go away and I write a law, and they haven't done any analysis. I don't really know what the current system is. I can read the law, but I don't actually know how it's practiced, how it's really implemented. I don't know their administrative structure. It's a disaster. I can write a law, and I frequently do, and then they look at it and say, not sure we want that law. And then we really start horse trading, and what can we do, and then how can we implement it. I think the most ridiculous one I ever did was for the Northwest Frontier Province, where they dragged me out there, and I sat in, where did I sit? Oh God, I can't remember the name of the big city in the Northwest Frontier Province, but anyway, we all sat there with no electricity, and I could hear the guns, and we wrote a little children's law. And then UNICEF said to me, well, can you do a plan to implement it? And I said, well, how many children are there in the Northwest Frontier Province? She said, 20 million. So I said, not really, no. It's terribly difficult. So I think having a law is one good step, but it doesn't always take us very far. Sometimes also you'll see law reform to pick off a particular violation. So in Georgia, they had a special vocational school, which is really a juvenile prison. And they decided, well, they'll take that out. They're going to stop sending children to this awful, awful place. And they passed a law that closed down the special vocational centres. However, what they hadn't thought about was that the result was that more children went to prison. So, you know, on the one hand that's good, and on the other hand the law of unintended consequences rolls around, and actually it ended up worsening the situation. Or you can have these, model projects where in Albania they decided they'd introduce child labour committees into every local authority, and they basically not only protected children from exploitative child labour, but also ended up providing child protection, completely de-skilling the local authority. And when the money stopped for the model projects, what have you got left? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, because the local authority had lost whatever child protection skills they had, giving it all to the pilot projects to do. So it's a problem. So when we go in there, we really have a good look around. Well, what's the best way here to implement? Where can we intervene in the most effective manner? And sometimes it's go in at the bottom and change practice, and sometimes it's go in at the top and change policy or change the law. So we were asked to go and work with UNICEF in Tanzania. And surprisingly, because they don't usually want to do this, the Ministry of Constitutional and Legal Affairs decided that they'd quite like us to have a really good look at what was going on in relation to access to justice. So we trotted around 10 huge districts. As you can see, we met an awful lot of people. We had a huge number of questionnaires at the end of it. That was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed it. And we got the chance to speak to lots of children about rights. And you can see we looked at all different issues. But what we really wanted to know from the kids, because we wanted to do a baseline survey. Law's great, but if nobody knows about it and nobody uses it, then, it's not a great tool. So we wanted to know whether children actually understood about rights. Do they know what they're entitled to? Do they know how to enforce those rights? How do they do it? Where do they do it? Where can they get the help they need? Perhaps you won't be surprised to find out that for a range of reasons, access to justice was pretty abysmal. Children don't actually understand their rights. So what you and I might see as an issue of law, so for instance, if you're assaulted or you're kicked out of your house or somebody steals your goods, they don't necessarily see that as a legal issue. They might see that as a communal issue or a society issue, but they don't necessarily see it as a legal issue. And so they don't go to lawyers, they don't seek legal advice. They might actually ask a neighbour to help them. It's seen much more as a social issue than a legal issue. And that lack of understanding and lack of knowledge goes right through the system. So you're not going to enforce rights, you're not going to access justice if you have no concept that you actually have a right. We found it pretty difficult when we looked at provision of legal aid. I found it fascinating. I used to be a legal services commissioner here in the UK, so I'm particularly interested in legal aid. It's nearly all provided by NGOs, and a lot of it's provided to women, simply because they were the most disadvantaged, and those are the NGOs that set up, and those are the NGOs that practice. It's pretty variable geographically. And variable quality. So you might have lawyers or you might just have paralegals. Barely any of them provide representation in court, to my initial surprise. What they do is they help people with paperwork, but they don't go much further than that. They don't take criminal cases. So actually, I would say probably 99% of legal aid, if one can really call it legal aid, is civil cases. It's land rights, property rights, maintenance on separation. So that means children aren't getting any form of legal representation when they're charged with an offence. They do, however, have a Law of the Child Act, which covers juvenile justice, it covers child protection, it covers child labour, it covers child maintenance, but lovely on the statute books. I mean, actually it's not a great act with lots and lots of slips and mistakes, but they haven't implemented it. So it sits there, but nobody does much with it. Why don't they do much with it? Well, first of all, one of the major reasons they don't do much with it is that it's all in English and not in Kiswahili. So while the magistrate can read, most of the magistrates, if they're at the higher end of the magistracy, can read the law in English, everybody else can't. So, in order to know your rights, you actually do have to be able to read the law. And if it's not in a language you actually know, it's not desperately helpful. They don't have enough magistrates, but they have the most appalling case management. Nobody is responsible for anything. So you have tons and tons of adjournments because someone doesn't show up, the magistrate, the prosecutor, the witnesses, the police don't bring the file, of which there is only one. There's lots of poor case management. Financial resources extremely limited. So you have terrible courtrooms. I mean, nobody would think to repair a roof. So when the roof has a hole in it, the water comes in and the building gets worse and worse until it collapses. Their filing system was particularly interesting, which involved basically just dumping them on the ground in a room, and then they would pile up and rot. So how they ever found anything is beyond me. Don't have computers for magistrates, so they did for the administrative staff in quite a lot of courts. Administrative staff were mostly busy playing games on the computers. Don't have pens and papers. It's a disaster. And then there's a rather difficult problem, which is they don't have enough lawyers. So they've got around 2,300 for 27 million people. In Zanzibar, which has a population of 1.7 million, they've got 52 registered lawyers, of whom only 15 actually practice in the courts. So that's pretty limiting. Lack of transport, so children don't get brought from the detention centres to the courts. And that, of course, is another reason for adjournment. So delay, and more delay. So where to start? Well, as you can see from all of that, it's a real problem in all areas, but we were looking particularly at juvenile justice with a view to working with the government on implementation. So a kid can be charged and his parents never know that he or she has been charged. They just won't be informed, and the child's actually not given any evidence from the police. I mean, they'll know what the charge is, but they won't know the evidence on which the charge is based. The police overcharge, so they'll charge a child with grievous bodily harm when actually we would charge with common assault, or at most assault occasioning actual bodily harm. One of the consequences of that is you get a high level of remand because the money that's required in order to bail the child is higher because the offence is higher. Lots of false confessions. Lots of allegations of false confessions and beating, and a lot of the charges end up being withdrawn. So the child sits in a remand centre for 4 months, 6 months, and then that's it, out they go. No criminal legal aid, no duty lawyers, not anywhere. We interviewed, I think, something like 216 kids in retention, remand centres. Not one of them had legal advice. So, where to from here? Well, we have the Law of the Child Act, and all cases are meant to be heard by a juvenile court. But that doesn't happen because there's only one juvenile court in the country, and that makes it a little difficult. So what we agreed with the government is that all juvenile cases in Dar es Salaam, the capital, well, not the capital, but the main city, would all go into this one juvenile court. And then we agreed with the Chief Justice that we would draft the juvenile court rules, because without rules the Act can't be implemented. So we are now doing a set of rules with a judicial technical committee, which will make that court inquisitorial rather than adversarial, child-friendly, etc., etc. And they've agreed to translate the Act. On top of the rule change, we worked with UNICEF to put in a pilot legal aid project. So we're going to have a duty lawyer at the juvenile court in Dar es Salaam, and the lawyer will also go to 2 remand homes to pick up the children who've been remanded and don't have legal representation. It was really interesting when we mapped the 86 children who are in these 2 remand homes. We looked at how many hearings they'd had, how long they'd been there, what they were charged with. Did their parents know? Where did they come from? Etc., etc., etc. So we've got them all mapped, and we want to follow those 86 children through until final hearing and then on. We'll provide them all with representation. We've also got the magistrates and the prosecutor and the social workers to agree to set up what we're going to call a case flow committee, so that we can sit down with them and discuss problems in the way that the court operates. You know, who's causing the problem and what can we do to address it? And we want to speed up the process. I've sat in the juvenile court on several occasions, and I find it absolutely gobsmacking, actually. So they'll have a file. Child has no evidence whatsoever, no file, nothing. Actually, nobody speaks to the child in any event, so it doesn't really matter whether the child has a file or not. And then there's a conversation between the prosecution and the magistrate, which is really nearly all administrative. But one of the cases I sat in, the charge was grievous bodily harm, but the fact was that one girl had slapped another. I think pretty hard slap, but common assault. There was no discussion at all as to whether or not the charge was incorrect. It was really interesting. It's just administrative issues, and they go in every 2 weeks and have this administrative discussion. But it takes maybe 4 or 5 months to actually get round to having a trial. They don't even discuss, well, shall we set a date for the trial? So we'd like to speed up the process and cut the level of remand. But in order to do that, we've also set up a diversion project, what we're going to call a community rehabilitation project, so that the children can be sent into this community-based programme instead of actually being remanded. And we need street children's shelters, which we also got, which exist already, which we'll use in the programme, so that kids who have nowhere to go, and quite a lot of them don't have anywhere to go, can be placed there. So, the outcome, we're just starting. 1st of July, the project started, and they've started taking their first cases on the legal aid project. We'll go back and look at the 86 children, and we'll map the new kids as they come in. We should catch every child who's in that remand centre, because we'll have caught them at the court, or we will catch them at the remand centre. And we want to map the new ones against the 86 to see, can we measure difference? Because quite clearly what the funders are going to say to us is, well, what difference have you made? Okay, so you provided legal representation, but what's the impact on children of doing that? Another question is, who will pay for legal aid once it's over, the 3-year project is over? Will the government pay for legal aid? That's an issue to be addressed. How do we train magistrates, prosecutors, social workers, police, and change attitudes? How do we do that? And we have to think quite hard about that. And then how do we build networks? When we go out and we're not pushing, how then do we produce sustainable change? Should we set the system up, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is implemented, and things move on? So that's me and our project in Tanzania.
Thank you very much.